Hello, my name is Jane Lydon. I'd like to welcome you all to our 7th online seminar on writing slavery into Australian history, hosted by the Western Australian Legacies of British Slavery Project in collaboration with the National Centre for Biography. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that we're holding this event here in Perth on the traditional country of the Whadjuk Noongar people, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Today we'll be hearing from Paul Arthur and Isabel Smith. The title of their talk is Exhibiting Slavery. So over to you, Paul and Isabel.
I'm very pleased that Isabel Smith and I have the chance to present this seminar on exhibiting slavery as part of our series. I'm just going to share my screen with you. Representations and silences relating to slavery in exhibition spaces have changed significantly over time in conjunction with shifting global political and social movements and academic paradigms. This paper will explore and contextualise these shifts using examples from the Americas, Europe, Africa and Oceania. As with any cultural patterns and shifts, these are not uniform. Furthermore, the history of transatlantic slavery has produced plural and conflicting memories and representations over the 3 centuries that our study is primarily concerned with, and across many geographical spaces. While we will not attempt to provide a comprehensive survey of representations on slavery or trends in exhibition spaces, we will trace some of the developments in interpretive and narrative strategies in representations of slavery, with particular attention to the recent biographical turn. Where possible, we will also explore the tensions between the emergence of, on the one hand, the previously silenced or marginalised voices and an evolving interpretive culture in museums, and on the other, the weight of dominant discourses and institutions. And we'll use this analysis to raise questions we face as we prepare to turn our research on the legacies of slavery into a public exhibition. Although there have been some localised analyses of exhibitions on slavery, very few scholars have attempted a broad investigation of international scope. Some of the most extensive work has been carried out by Ana Lucia Urahu. Urahu is concerned with the memorialisation of slavery, the process of revisiting and revising the slavery past by bringing its physical and immaterial traces into the present. She examines this process through established public sites of memory, such as exhibitions, monuments and memorials, but she's also interested in the sites that emerge through cultural practices such as festivals, sharing of stories and oral traditions, social activities in families and communities, and religious practices, as well as material objects such as photographs. She emphasises the many and conflicting forms of memory being fought out between individuals, social groups and societies, and between dominant and marginalised discourses. Her work is framed by deep concern for the impact that memorialisations have upon contemporary politics and lived realities. She's particularly interested in questions around reparations and argues that slavery memory is born out of ongoing frameworks of race and white supremacy. Urahu has focused in particular on the South Atlantic, but also produced comparative analyses and edited collections examining the Americas, Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean. There have also been a number of more localised studies of slavery exhibitions. In 2003, Jamaican historian Vereen Shepherd analysed slavery memorials across the Caribbean, tracing monuments to anti-slavery heroes, but lamenting the dearth of memorials to the unsung rebels. In the United Kingdom, analyses developed in particular around the bicentenary of the 1807 abolition of slavery. British scholars interrogated the cultural memory being produced in a proliferation of public speeches, commemorations, exhibitions, and memorials. The University of York developed a project entitled 1807 Commemorated, which produced a range of exhibition reviews and analyses, including a paper by John Beach tracing the developments, but also stagnations in representations of slavery. And more recently, in 2020, Jessica Moody published her examination of slavery memory in Liverpool. Moody situates museum displays within a broader 200-year-long history of the city to examine the ways deep-seated narratives around slavery, empire, and race influence and interact with exhibitions. Others have used discussions of slavery memory to question and broaden our understandings of the term exhibition. Indeed, we must critically examine this concept. While at first the word often conjures up images of objects and artworks within the traditional white cube or museum space, in a broader sense, an exhibition might refer to public monuments and statues, experiments in town planning, websites, apps, printed publications, and many other forms. In Exhibiting Slavery, the Caribbean postmodern novel as museum, Vivian Nunn Halloran argues that the postmodern historical novel in many ways resembles a contemporary museum exhibition. Halloran draws parallels between both forms, tendencies to reject imposing narratives and historical or narrative closure, and their use of fragmented or reworked narratives, as well as their anachronistic and sometimes apocryphal sources. She imaginatively sketches out an almost three-dimensional form of the postmodern novel in a way that resembles a contemporary exhibition. These novels, Halloran writes, create a museum effect by exhibiting slavery through the use of quotations or vignettes. They are museums without walls. In this discussion, we will employ this broader definition of exhibitions to explore traditional physical exhibitions as well as digital spaces and literature. One of the earliest representations of slavery in an exhibition space occurred at what many consider to be the origins of the modern museum. At the 1851 Great Exhibition in Crystal Palace, 3 enslaved people placed themselves on display: William Wells Brown, William Craft, and Ellen Craft. They had fled to London from the United States, where the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act allowed slave owners to pursue slaves who had escaped into free states. Brown and the Crafts appeared multiple times during the course of the exhibition. However, their most strategic performance occurred in June in front of a crowd of 15,000, including the royal family, members of parliament, and leading business figures. Arm in arm with white abolitionists of the opposite sex, they perambulated the palace for the entire day before positioning themselves alongside American sculptor Hiram Powers, the Greek slave. Power's sculpture depicted an alabaster figure of an enslaved Greek girl imagined under the gaze of licentious slave traders, which had attracted romanticised and sympathetic commentary in the United States. While standing next to the sculpture, Brown also placed alongside it an image of the Virginian slave, a caricature by Don Tenniel, published in Punch magazine. In her analysis of their performance, Lisa Merrill argues that these so-called fugitive slaves used the opportunity of the world stage both to hold up a mirror and subvert the gaze of all civilised nation-states assembled. And Brown in particular was a well-known abolitionist lecturer and accomplished orator who also wrote and performed in the first play written by an African American. Rather than merely being regarded by others as visual spectacles, I'm quoting here, Merrill contends, these three people would transform and reappropriate their audience's gaze in an explicitly performative act of self-determination, quote. This underscores the inherent tensions between the transatlantic slave trade and the colonial origins of museums, and questions around the use of voice, space, and audience in representations of slavery, which we will continue to explore throughout this discussion. Despite such early attempts at interventions and representations of slavery, public exhibitions consciously addressing the issue of slavery have only emerged comparatively recently. Araujo explains that, quote, in most European, African and American societies, the traces of more than 3 centuries of slave trade and slavery remained concealed in the public space. She argues this was in large part due to the challenges that slavery memories would pose to the power structures of these places. And I'll quote again here. In these societies, that largely benefited from a slave workforce, most descendants of the perpetrators continued to occupy prominent social, economic, and political positions, which they would not risk by accurately recalling past moral transgressions of their societies. Increasingly, however, dominant discourses that excluded the realities of the slave trade were challenged. As Araujo identifies, this shift gained particular momentum in the second half of the 20th century, with the rise of the civil rights movement in the United States. African American activists spoke of histories and experiences of marginalisation as well as agency. In 1976, Alex Haley published his novel Roots, the Saga of an American Family, depicting the life of Kunta Kinte, a young man taken from Gambia and sold as a slave, and the lives of his descendants. This novel was turned into a popular mini-series the following year, bringing to a much wider audience experiences of enslaved people and building on the print genre of slave narratives that have been developing since the late 18th century, while also challenging romanticised and passive depictions of enslaved people in texts such as Gone with the Wind. Simultaneously in Africa and the Caribbean, the process of decolonisation moved in conjunction with the construction of increasing numbers of monuments to those who resisted and fought slavery, including Bassa in Barbados, Gaspayanga in Mexico, and Carlotto in Cuba. In Europe, memories and reflections of the Second World War were being turned over, and the horrors of the Holocaust were being confronted with increasing depth. By the 1980s, as survivors began to pass away, Holocaust memory became a central focus within the nascent field of memory studies. Amid these social, political, and academic developments, by the 1990s, slavery commemorations had become a central concern. In 1994, UNESCO launched the Slave Route Project, Resistance, Liberty, Heritage, aimed at better understanding the ongoing global consequences of slavery, identifying and outlining guides for sites of slavery memory, and promoting the contributions of people of African descent in contemporary communities. In the 1990s and 2000s, public exhibitions explicitly addressing slavery proliferated. Following some notable early instances in West Africa beginning in the 1960s, in particular initiatives aimed at preserving slave trade castles and fortresses, museums across Europe, the Americas, and the Caribbean began representing and examining slavery memory. In 2007, amid the bicentenary of abolition commemorations in the United Kingdom, the International Slavery Museum was opened in Liverpool. Once just a small part of the Merseyside Maritime Museum, this major new space signified growing national attention to the UK's involvement in the histories and legacies of the slave trade. It also represented a shift away from what John Beach terms the maritimisation of slavery, in which museums locate slavery as a subset of greater histories, a practice that not only diminishes this history but also places it within wide frameworks of trading routes and transport heritage. Similarly, Araho writes that, particularly in the past, I'll quote from her again here, official institutions like museums and their permanent and temporary exhibitions often ignored or avoided the topic slavery, which was usually presented as one of the various components of maritime history and labour history. Today, monuments and memories of slavery are being re-examined in new and often radical ways. With the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, dominant discourses favouring slave owners and colonists are being interrogated and dismantled, and in their place there is a rising wave of new voices and different kinds of narratives. While representations of slavery pasts have been mobilised and fought out for decades, these recent events have brought the politics of remembering into decidedly sharp focus. We'll pay particular attention to the questions raised by contemporary politics towards the end of our discussion. But we'll now trace some shifts in interpretive and narrative strategies that tie in with these shifting politics. Hand over to you, Isabel.
Thank you, Paul. Particularly in the past 2 decades, museums have increasingly turned their attention to personal stories and intimate storytelling. Through the hook of an individual character, curators and artists create symbols of or channels into broader and more complex narratives and themes. This shift to the personal can be understood as part of a wider shift that has been occurring beyond museums, in particular within academia. In 2002, Tom Wengrath, Prue Chamberlain, and Joanna Bornat referred to a biographical turn occurring in the social sciences. They described this as, and I quote, a subjective or cultural turn in which personal and social meanings as bases of action gain greater prominence, end quote. Some argue that museums have always been concerned with personal stories. Alexandra Bernier contends that, be it through the prominence of curators, profiles on collectors, or influential historical figures, museums have had a biographical focus since their very origins. However, as Bernier points out, it's only more recently that biography has expanded to include, and I quote, microhistory, the anonymous individual, and groups of people that have been hitherto ignored by the traditional biography, end quote, which opens new forms of museum interpretation and critique, which we will explore through our examples. The biographical turn in museums has intersected with exhibitions on slavery. Increasingly, the horrors and complexities of the slave trade have been explored through names, faces, and lived experiences of the past. The work of Buddy Meyer First Nation woman and painter Julie Dowling is a particularly poignant example of this, and it's important to emphasise here that Julie does not refer to herself as an Australian Aboriginal. Dowling's 2017 exhibition, Malga Galbal, Hard Secret, depicts First Nations people whose lives were variously and tragically changed by slavery following colonisation in Australia. The image on this slide, entitled The Pearl Divers, shows two unknown pearl divers from the northwest of Western Australia. Dowling explains that many, and I quote again, many First Nation children were stolen to grow up in the commercial pearl industry as slaves, receiving nothing but food and shelter, end quote. And she goes on to describe the violent and often fatal experiences of pearl divers in Australia. Dowling's vividly coloured portraits of pearl divers, domestic servants, pastoral workers, and trackers bring to life individuals who speak to greater themes of stolen wages, cultural dispossession, violence, and racism in past and contemporary Australia. The anonymous title of this and other works also underscores a central challenge when trying to paint the lives of those from the past, and especially those dispossessed and marginalised. Few records and little information remain. We'll continue exploring this point throughout our discussion. The biographizing approach in many ways moves in tandem with another shift, one away from grand and often singular narratives of histories, and towards plural, fragmented, and complex stories and experiences. Halloran writes that, and I quote, both contemporary museology and postmodernist narrative theory reject all-encompassing grand narratives in favour of inclusive representations of multiple voices from different subject positions and experiences. A case in point is the New York Historical Society's 2005 exhibition, Slavery in New York. Avoiding simplistic storylines and political and social binaries, this large-scale and multifaceted show instead regularly highlighted historical debates and complexities. For instance, it complicated the often glorified role of Dutch colonists in New Amsterdam and explained that Black combatants and supporters fought on both sides of the American Revolution. The exhibition also challenged rigid chronological boundaries by overlaying archival and contemporary content and giving new life to historical materials. One example is the large-scale animation of a parade of people celebrating the end of slavery in New York in 1827. Throughout the exhibition were myriad and complex experiences of individuals and communities, including an examination of the diversity of African people before the beginnings of the slave trade, multiple cultural perspectives of death and dying, a list of 19th century African American churchgoers' names which highlighted their Irish, Dutch, English, and Scottish backgrounds, contemporary footage of mixed congregation churches, and 4 galleries dedicated largely to individual biographies and enslaved and free people of colour. Curators and artists outline these human experiences in physical and poetic forms through life-size wire figures of enslaved people, seen on the slide here. In her review of the show, Laura Shimolewski argued that it, and I quote, succeeded in smashing the overly simplistic and of course patently inaccurate dichotomies of North-South and free-unfree labour. It further succeeded in reclaiming the lives of a large population of early American people by examining them in all their ethnic and experiential complexity. The depth and nuance of slavery in New York can be attributed in practical terms to its resources. The show comprised 9 galleries across 6 rooms and 9,000 square feet, with a budget of $5 million. However, these qualities also reflect a more contemporary curatorial approach to exploring themes in all of their complexity through multiple individual experiences. Furthermore, it signifies powerfully a new level of dedication to the history of slavery. The exhibition's chief historian, James Oliver Horton, wrote that, quote, slavery was not a sideshow in American history, it was the main event, end quote. In contrast to past shows which may have maritimized or minimized slavery as a component of other histories, this exhibition placed it front and center. These considerations around narrative and biographical complexity raise a number of critical questions for us when thinking about creating an exhibition. Firstly, to what extent will we use personal stories to represent broader narratives or themes? Are we indeed aiming to sketch out a broader narrative, or would we prefer instead to present multiple fragments of stories and experiences? Is there space for conflicting histories? Furthermore, is it in fact possible to create an exhibition without imposing overarching narrative frames? How would such an exhibition divide and organize content? Thematically, chronologically? Would there be prescribed pathways? Art exhibitions may be better placed to achieve fragmented and plural representations of slavery than traditional history exhibitions. In his analysis of abolition bicentenary commemorations in the UK, Geoffrey Cubitt commented, "A museum of art such as the Whitworth Gallery in Manchester, used to evoking multiple perspectives and relatively unshackled by any expectation that its exhibition should supply the public with a basic historical narrative, could encourage guest curators creatively to dialogize objects in the museum collection and to express their own views on these objects freely and provocatively. Elsewhere, however, a more cautious spirit tended to prevail. Museums strove to recognize different voices and perspectives, but were often reluctant to relinquish overall narrative control. Licensed expressions of subjectivity supplemented, rather than supplanted, more conventional presentations of slavery's history." End quote. In this space where grand narratives are being challenged with multiple and complex individual experiences, exhibitions have offered more platforms for stories of Black resistance, particularly in the face of well-worn narratives of abolition. Until recent decades, exhibitions have typically presented abolition largely, or even entirely, as the product of white abolitionists and authorities. This plays into a broader tension, which those in the UK in particular have critiqued, in which powerful commemorative discourses have subsumed the history of slavery under the history of abolition, what John Oldfield terms a culture of abolition. Catherine Hall notes, quote, "Our problem in Britain is the forgetting of the slavery business and slavery. A further problem for us is that what's been remembered is abolition. Abolition is seen in Britain as part of what's called the golden thread of English liberty," end quote. During the 2007 bicentenary commemorations of abolition, this reached such a height that commentators, in reference to obsessions with abolitionist William Wilberforce, derisively termed the event a Wilberfest and Wilberfarce. Indeed, in museum spaces, stories of Black resistance and agency have often been silenced in favour of stories of freedom and liberty from white abolitionists. The 1973 exhibition, Aspects of Slavery, by the Bahamas Public Records Office, outlined the end of slavery through records including a portrait of abolitionist Sir James Carmichael Smith, the Emancipation Acts of 1834 and 1838, and a compensation payment for absentee slave owner Lord John Roll. While it detailed one claim to freedom made by an enslaved woman named Nancy, in which a man named John Hayes swears that she is free, it explained that, quote, John Hayes' evidence was not admissible against a white man's, and Nancy was therefore unable to prove her case, end quote. There are no further references to resistance. The simplistic narrative is presumably in part due to limited records. This made it easy to favour the colonial authorities who created the records and the Commonwealth authorities who preserved them. However, it is also typical of the ways of seeing and dominant discourses of the time. More recently, exhibitions have increasingly used stories of resistance and individual agency to counter these dominant narratives. In his analysis of 1807 bicentenary commemorations, in contrast to claims of the Wilberfarce, Cubitt argued that a bridge between the themes of abolitionism and of African agency was being built through, quote, the attention paid in most bicentenary exhibitions to the role of Black abolitionists, Ottobah Cugoano, Ignatius Sancho, but above all, Olaudah Equiano, whose ubiquity in the bicentenary year rivaled that of Wilberforce and Clarkson, end quote. Cubitt also noted Liverpool's International Slavery Museum statement that Africans, despite their oppression, were the main agents in their own liberation. ISM head Richard Benjamin commented that, and I quote, ISM makes Africa and Africans the central agents of the whole museum narrative. This approach is developed by starting with areas of achievement, often born out of resistance. This starting point for the narrative of transatlantic slavery and its legacies is a way for some audiences to begin their journey of dialogue with the subject. In the United States, slavery in New York explored Black activists including Peter Williams Jr. and Reverend William Hamilton, and the use of Black churches to connect abolitionist arguments with religious tenets, as well as the use of petitions by free people of colour. More recently, the Jamaican slave revolt map created by Vincent Brown and his team at Harvard University offers a striking example of contemporary content offering public audiences new sights into resistance. This animated and interactive digital map details the spatial history of the 1760 to 1761 slave revolt in Jamaica, plotting out the combatants' movements to outline their three major uprisings and explore their strategic aims. Although it uses more cartographic than biographical narration, this map is fleshed out with personal excerpts from colonists' diaries and letters, as well as archival material from military and administrative records and periodicals. The map that Brown and his team have created offers a clever and innovative use of seemingly one-sided colonial records to develop more intimate knowledge of the actions and experiences of enslaved people. But contemporary representations of resistance continue to evolve and struggle against dominant discourses. Cubitt argued in 2007 that with the exception of a select few, such as the ISM, quote, few museums really integrated an extended analysis of resistance into larger narrative structures, end quote. While Cubitt did identify a growing shift towards looking at collective social forces behind abolitionism, many argue that these collective analyses and biographies have much further to come. In her analysis of slavery memorials across the Caribbean, Doreen Shepherd pointed out that while there were monuments to Black leaders such as Samuel Sharp and Bussa, there were no monuments to the masses of enslaved people who fought in the Emancipation Wars. She argued that despite the evolution in war memorials across the world, seen in their shift in emphasis from the military elite to the rank and file, or the so-called glorious dead, there was not a single monument in the Caribbean devoted to what she terms the unsung heroes and heroines. And I quote her again, "Where are our war dead? What were their names? Where are the explicit sites of memory to them? There are statues to commemorate the revolutionary heroes all over the region, but where are the unsung rebels?" A central question these examples raise for us is, whose stories are being told? Those of enslaved people, slave owners, famous and infamous figures, or so-called ordinary people? How can the stories of slave owners and colonists be used to interrogate dominant discourses? If we choose to examine these figures, even if to expose their ties to imperial and often racist ideologies and systems, are we still preferencing their experiences over others? Can the stories of slave owners also be used to open up spaces for stories of resistance? Furthermore, who is telling the stories, or who is speaking, and on behalf of whom? When is it appropriate for a curator to speak on behalf of a descendant of an enslaved person, or a person affected by trauma? Cubitt refers to interviews conducted by researcher Ross Wilson with museum staff involved with 1807 commemorations. And he explains that many struggled to engage, and I quote, with a painful history in which others had not just a fierce emotional investment, but a claim of ownership, end quote. Many curators had no experience working with members of Black communities, and many consultations, quote, often improvised at short notice, frequently failed to meet the expectations of active empowerment and genuine dialogue that they aroused in those consulted, end quote. This not only raises questions around ownership and methods of community engagement and facilitation, but around the limits of representation. This has been a central question to those working in Holocaust studies. Reflecting on representations of the Holocaust in Art Spiegelman's graphic novel Mouse, Erin McLaughlin refers to what she terms profound incompatibility between the author's lived contemporary experience and the incomprehensibly tragic and traumatic experiences of his characters. When trying to exhibit the experiences of transatlantic slavery, often termed the African Holocaust, how do we represent the unthinkable? As Alison A. Roy Eckart put it, how is the unspeakable to be spoken about? We ought to speak about it, all right, but how can we ever do so? How can we balance the need to tell the stories with the ethical dilemma inherent in displaying other people's suffering? In some spaces, the voices and experiences of those otherwise lost in the past live on. In their analysis of community museums in Rio de Janeiro, Francine Sayong and Pedro Samanard examined the Museo do Negro, or the Black Museum, which originated through the efforts of communities of enslaved people and their allies in Brazil. The Black Museum is housed within the walls of an 18th century church built entirely by enslaved individuals, who were at the time allowed to build their own churches to worship their own saints and bury their deceased. The museum itself was established in 1960 and is thought to be the conception of the first Black marshal in Brazil, João Baptista de Matos, a former director of the Brotherhood of St. Benedict. Since the 17th century, brotherhoods played a central supportive role to enslaved and free people of colour in Brazil. The Brotherhood of St. Benedict has maintained the museum and collected objects owned by slaves who were able to buy their freedom with the Brotherhood's help. Sorry, I should have said owned by enslaved people. Sayon and Simonard argue that in a city where no major museums are dedicated to the memory of slavery, and in a country where discourses championing the myth of racial democracy, as they say, and a singular, harmonious Brazilian identity overshadow Afro-Brazilian culture and the history of slavery, this museum offers these histories through the objects and communities of those who lived them. The Black Museum might be considered a particularly early example of a new form of museum, one that creates alternative sites for slavery memories to dwell in. It raises not only the question of voice, but of space. As the so-called fugitive slaves performance at the 1851 Great Exhibition laid bare so acutely, the colonial foundations of museums make traditional exhibition halls extremely loaded spaces. Subaltern voices must find ways to combat the weight of the archive and the institution. Increasingly, traditional curatorial and institutional voices are being countered by new kinds of spaces as well as new storytellers. Stephen E. Weil writes, "In a dozen different contexts, identity and interest groups of every kind insist that the mainstream museum is neither empowered nor qualified to speak on their behalf. Increasingly, such groups are creating their own museums from which to speak in their own voices and address what they consider to be their own issues." Opportunities for these alternative sites and voices have expanded in particular through the explosion of digital technologies. As seen with the Jamaican slave revolt interactive map, online spaces have created new platforms for content outside of the traditional museum mould, and for narratives that challenge dominant discourses. These increasingly digital, multi-sensory and immersive formats are particularly well suited to intimate first-person storytelling. A recent example of this is the 2015 app, Slavery at Monticello, Life and Work on Mulberry Row, which tells the stories of those who worked at Thomas Jefferson's 5,000-acre plantation in Charlottesville, Virginia. These stories are deliberate interventions in the dominant narrative of Jefferson's life and home. In the promotional material for this app, the viewer sees an image of Jefferson and is told that, quote, "History is typically told through the eyes of well-known historical figures, but that is only one perspective," end quote. The app augments historical documents and photographs of enslaved people with interviews of their descendants, and using geolocation technology activates information and audio stories as visitors move around the Monticello site, creating multi-sensory experiences that help visitors visualize and imagine the lives of those enslaved. Importantly, these stories highlight the dignity, the strength, and the capacity for happiness, the creativity and the pride of the people, with slavery as the frame but not the defining principle of their lives. Victimhood is less prominent in these decentered, multidimensional, multimedia approaches. In a similar vein, in 2019, the not-for-profit organisation Historic Hudson Valley released their interactive documentary, People Not Property, Stories of Slavery in the Colonial North. In response to the dominance of narratives set in southern plantations, this online documentary explores the overlooked experiences of enslaved people in the North. Users can navigate their way back and forth across 4 chapters, defining slavery, being enslaved, choosing resistance, and pursuing justice. The documentary interweaves historical documents, illustrations, and photographs with contemporary artworks and poetry, as well as high-quality short films with actors, depicting first-hand experiences of enslaved people. These digital interpretations offer new ways of imagining lived experiences of slavery. More than this, they offer examples of the unique potential for art to enter into the gaps in histories where the archives cannot. Like the life-size wire figures from slavery in New York, they reinstate those from the past who have been left out of traditional narratives. Reflecting on her 1987 novel, Beloved, Toni Morrison argued that we must re-inhabit those who have been disremembered and dismembered by history. She coined the term re-memory to describe a process of recollecting pasts previously unknown but rediscovered. In her novel, Morrison tells the story of Seth, an enslaved woman who has killed her own daughter, Beloved, and is now plagued by her ghost. The work is inspired by the real story of enslaved woman Margaret Garner, who took her own child's life out of desperate fear that she would be raised as a slave. Beloved is not a factual account of Garner's life, a virtually impossible task given the limited records devoted to enslaved people. However, Morrison draws an important distinction between fact and truth. She contends that, quote, facts can exist without human intelligence, but truth cannot, end quote. Morrison asserts the role of the writer and of the artist in interpreting our worlds, even when some of the facts may be missing, to unearth and represent deeper truths. The work of Julie Dowling operates in this same space. Commenting on this painting on the slide entitled Unknown Woman in Green, Dowling writes, I wanted to paint these First Nation people because they are unknown individuals whose spirit lives on only in the drawers of museums and antique collectors. I am claiming these images and reinterpreting or translating them for my family and myself as Indigenous people today. Dowling's figures, often surrounded by symbols of rivers, trees, and spirits as protection, artistically re-inhabit those whose lives are not done justice by archival records and museum collections. These artistic representations also elicit different responses and forms of learning when compared to archival historical accounts. Recently, museums have shifted their attention to the potential for emotional learning as a way of enhancing intellectual understandings. Some argue that museums should in fact be striving for empathy. Halloran refers to the emergence of trauma museums, where intensely emotive displays are often followed by quiet and dimly lit spaces for reflection. This shift, which might be referred to as an emotional term, goes particularly hand in hand with intimate first-person storytelling. But there is another change that appears to be underway in this context, and that can be described as a moving away from giving prime of place to the display of suffering and injustice, and instead placing increasing emphasis on honouring the multiple facets of everyday lived experience and celebrating, where possible, strength and triumph, while not denying the larger framework of enslavement. These examples help us reflect and build upon questions of whose stories are being told, and by whom, and ask, through what medium and interpretive style are we telling these stories? Through didactic text, or multi-sensory immersive forms, through third-person curatorial voice or first-person voice, a combination of these modes? More than this, what sort of experience would we like to encourage from visitors? Intellectual understanding, emotional and social learning, empathy? Museum interpretation and studies are becoming increasingly interested in visitor experience and engagement, and in studying the ways in which content is received. Do we want visitors to learn facts, to feel deeply, or perhaps even to feel moved to act? What sort of impact would we like an exhibition to have? Perhaps the bigger question underlying all of this is, for what purpose are we bringing the past into the present? If it is to shine light on our current realities, how, and how explicitly, do we draw these connections between past and present? And I'll hand over to Cole again.
Thank you, Isabel. Increasingly, and as seen in our own research, discussions around slavery have focused on its legacies. The International Slavery Museum has been particularly explicit in exploring not only Britain's deep-seated and ongoing social and economic benefits delivered by the slave trade, but the continuing frameworks of race underpinning British culture. In 2007, the ISM named one of its spaces after Anthony Walker, the British college student of Jamaican descent who was murdered in a racially motivated attack in 2005 rather, drawing direct connections between Britain's slavery past and contemporary racism. Many exhibitions are also exploring the legacies issue through discussions of modern slavery. Reflecting on this in the UK, Cubitt cited a growing trend in neo-abolitionist displays, and I'll quote, "Attention was shifted here from transatlantic slavery as a particular historically located system of oppression and exploitation with particular groups of victims and perpetrators, to slavery in general, a capacious and variegated category of abuse whose projected eradication required a renewal of humanitarian zeal and reforming effort. In presentations along these lines, the legacy that was evoked was less the traumatic and destructive legacy of transatlantic slavery itself than the inspiring legacy of struggle against it and of abolitionism in particular." End quote. Cubitt's words underscore the ironic potential for discussions around legacies and unfinished business to key into and repeat the same racial frameworks that underpinned the slave trade. They also speak to the inherent politics of our mobilisations of the past and a debate over what sort of role museums can and should play in society and current politics. When creating such public sites of history and memory, how do we choose to frame the active and activate the past? Now, in particular, as the Black Lives Matter movement draws connections between the legacies of slavery across continents, and Australia's Prime Minister makes claims that slavery did not take place in Australia, how do we frame slavery memories? Dowling frames her work through an explicitly political message, which she aims at a wide audience. She asserts that she has produced her paintings, quote, "to emphasise the global case for compensation for slavery, stolen wages and cultural dispossession in an international arena for First Nation people," end quote. Similarly, the International Slavery Museum takes on a consciously political position. At its launch in 2007, British economist and cultural historian David Fleming asserted that, quote, "This is not a museum that could be described as a neutral place. It is a place of commitment, controversy, honesty and campaigning," unquote. ISM head Richard Benjamin aligns himself with Janet Marstein's statement that museums are not neutral spaces that speak with one institutional authoritative voice. Museums are about individuals making subjective choices. Benjamin writes, and I quote, "In essence, the ISM is intended to be a resource, a tool to be used in a multitude of ways by visitors, and which is gently oiled and well maintained by the museum staff. The ISM was designed to be an organism suited to the environment of the day, to be relevant to society and not afraid to focus on political or social issues. Here, Benjamin also speaks to a different model for a museum, in which content is increasingly opened up to the public and contemporary debates. He refers to a shift in ownership, made particularly apparent when Anthony Walker's sister referred to the Anthony Walker Education Centre as my brother's room. More and more museums are exploring ways of returning stories to communities and creating platforms for new voices. In the final gallery, In Slavery in New York, visitors were invited to record their own responses at a video talkback station. Some of these videos then appeared on screens throughout the exhibition space, intermingled with historical stories. This opening up and even handing over of content from curators to communities may offer some ideas in response to difficult questions around whose stories are being told and by whom, as well as how we navigate relationships between the past and present. By facilitating new and plural voices, these new approaches might also better reflect the many and conflicting histories and memories of slavery. Thank you very much to our audience for listening to our presentation. I'm looking now at some of the Q&A questions and chat that have come through in the last few minutes in particular, and I'd like to just respond. Thank you to Deirdre Coleman. We're grateful for you suggesting the work of Marcus Wood on empathy and pornography and blind memory. That's a really useful sort of angle. As well as your note about 2007 marking the abolition of the slave trade, not slavery itself. In fact, this is one of the real benefits of this format, that we're only just really starting out on this research, and especially in planning for this project to have a public exhibition. So your feedback is extremely helpful. Thank you very much.
I've also just seen a comment come through from, I think it was Sinead, I just lost the name, Sinead Williams. That's really interesting. Sinead says, I was hoping you would cover this about the Monticello, the digital app. She said, we visited Monticello in December 2011 and there was no mention at all of the slave history. An African-American family were on our tour. They were descendants of Monticello slaves and they asked where the slave graveyard was. And while the guide was very professional and did point it out through the window, other people on the tour were very uncomfortable. I'm so glad this has all changed. So that's really interesting. I didn't realize that the interpretation had changed so dramatically. Oh, here's another comment that's just come through.
Oh, thank you, Zoe, for your comment. I mean, what we've found in this initial research is that there are so many good examples that we can refer to. And so this one that you've mentioned here, the Baltimore National Museum, would be very useful to look up, and I'm grateful for your suggestion. One of the interesting questions that we've been discussing and just thinking about in a preliminary way is, in creating a new exhibition now, not in the past or in a different country or in a different context, how can we make an exhibition about slavery something that's contemporary and current and relevant in Australia and to our project? So these examples, I think we can learn a lot from. Thank you.
And I'll just jump back in here to say thank you very much. That was a really fascinating presentation. Thanks very much, Paul and Isabel. And I'd just like to conclude by reminding everyone that we have our final seminar next week. It will be a roundtable with our UK partner investigators, Catherine Hall, Keith McClelland and Alan Lester, and it will be held at a different time to accommodate live participation from the United Kingdom. So it will be 4 p.m. Perth time, 6 p.m. East Coast and 9 a.m. in the UK. So do please join us then for our final event. Thank you so much, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.